Hello folks, in today's guide we are covering absolutely everything you could possibly want to know when beginning your playthrough for Wuchang Fallen Feathers. Now, I've broken the guide down into sections and naturally there are timestamps below, but this is objectively a better experience when watched from start to finish, and that is due to us starting with the basics and then steadily working our way up to the most complicated and nuanced mechanics within the game. In regards to spoilers, I'm featuring a bunch of footage from Chapter 1 only, and I've been somewhat strict with what I'm showing, so as to not ruin too much fun for anyone. And finally, this guide is absolutely rammed with information, and we're not wasting any time, so let's get started. First up, we're going to do a quick rundown on the general ebb and flow of the game. Almost immediately in your playthrough, you'll find yourself at the Revenant Temple, where you'll find a handful of NPCs and your first shrine just sitting outside. Consider this almost as a hub area where you're safe from enemies and you can use various different services from the different NPCs. There's multiple variations of these locations within the game, such as the Shoe Sanctum, which you'll discover very early on in Chapter 1 also. Whilst here, and generally whenever you find any NPC, you will want to interact with them and exhaust all of their dialogue. There are many gifts and quests to be acquired by doing this, along with very good info regarding rewards, your goals, etc., if you are paying attention. In regards to receiving quests from NPCs, whenever interacting with a shrine and selecting the travel option, you will see that NPC portraits may be shown at certain locations. This is to indicate that you have a new interaction to have with them, whether it be quest or merchant related. It indicates you have unfinished business with that NPC, and it also confirms that they are in that area. Now, in addition to this, many of the merchants will expand their inventories upon receiving very specific items from yourself, which you will naturally acquire along your journey. This merchant, for example, accepts items from defeated bosses and in turn has armor sets available to purchase, depending on what you've already handed over. Essentially meaning you will want to constantly consider backtracking to previously visited locations in order to speak with and progress NPCs' questlines or respective inventories, and doing so will be very valuable in regards to finding useful equipment. So with that established, let's move on to the shrine itself, as it's a very solid starting off point for explaining quite a bit. Naturally, we have the travel option right here, which of course allows you to travel to other shrines, and we've discussed why we see certain NPC portraits already. Next, we have Enter Dream, which is quite simply the rest function. This will restore your vitals back to 100%, whilst also resetting all enemy respawns within the game and progressing any quest lines that you may have pending. Such as, you've just handed over an item, and then upon resting, that NPC has now moved from that location. Within the shrine menu, you also have a warehouse option, which is quite simply just your storage, and then the remaining 5 options are all a little bit more complicated than the previous few. Now, very quickly, folks, as you can probably tell, we are a humble and somewhat small channel here, which is why I'm very grateful to say that this video is sponsored by Xmod. Xmod is an all-in-one modding tool that includes thousands of free mods, cheats, and trainers for over 5,000 different single-player PC games. Using this, you can quite simply load up any game within Xmod, jumping right in with easy access to all manner of mods, which can be toggled on or off at your own leisure. We have day 1 mods for Wuchang, which I'll be using to streamline my own guide making process, but there are all manner of useful features here for your average gamer, as well as a vast array of additional features, the most exciting being this built-in resource map. But there are many others, and a selection of community mods, which does receive regular updates. There are thousands of trainers to choose from for practically any game you could ever want to play, and it is absolutely free. So if you would like to get into modding and want all of the hard work done for you, or if you are just curious and don't mind supporting the channel along the way, then I'll leave a sponsored link in the description below, and a huge thank you to Xmod again for making this video possible. To start, we're going to dive into the Impetus repository, which is Wuchang's fancy way of saying skill tree. Now, to summarize what's going on here, during your adventures, you will earn Red Mercury. This can be exchanged within the skill tree for Red Mercury Essence, which essentially acts as a skill point that you can then allocate to any slot available. And this means you can cash in your Red Mercury for Red Mercury Essence, and then those points are saved and stored, regardless of whether you allocate them or not. Additionally, the skill tree can be reset from the center whenever you like, and this has 0 cost. Now, the leftmost branch is a general branch, whilst the other 5 all focus on one individual weapon type, such as axes, spears, longswords, etc. I'd argue that for the very start of the game, the most important branch is the left, at least until having obtained the following upgrades, which would be Skyborn Call, which will increase your max Skyborn might to 3, and is pretty essential, and then just 2 upgrades over, you can grab a large vitality buff, which will grant around 10 to 15% extra max HP. Also very essential for so early on in the game. Close to these, we have the following upgrades, which would be mana capacity and mana potency, which either increase your max healing charges or your healing effectiveness respectively. These require additional rare items that you will bump into on your travels. And finally, the upgrades themselves are leveled. If you look right here, you'll see there are 2 more available levels for this one specific upgrade, and many upgrades across the entire skill tree can have multiple levels. Now, of course, in regards to the other 5 branches, it really comes down to what weapons you currently want to use. And as for this early in the game, there is no reason to put any upgrades into a weapon skill tree that you're not currently using. And it would be 100% more beneficial for you to strictly just allocate upgrades into the left branch and whatever 1 or 2 weapon branches that you are actually using. As you allocate points into the skill tree, it will begin to unlock more and more that you were previously unable to see. My best advice is to not become too overwhelmed here. Simply aim for skills and upgrades that suit your chosen playstyle the most, and once having come back here a few times, it's likely it will have become far less overwhelming. Now, we will come back to the skill tree later on, but it's best that we move on to cover weapons and some of the other combat mechanics first, before returning here and discussing any more. Coming back to the shrine, we're going to cover the Invoke option first, before moving on to weapons, which coincidentally involves Temper, Benediction, and Discipline. So, to explain Invoke, we first need to cover the Inner Demon mechanic. Essentially, the more you die or kill human enemies, the more you will fill up this Inner Demon gauge, and if you die whilst the gauge is at its maximum, your dropped Red Mercury will then be guarded by an Inner Demon, which is quite strong, has some tricky attacks, and is hostile to both yourself and all other enemies. Additionally, the higher your Inner Demon gauge is, then the more damage you will deal and receive. Now, you can deplete the entire Inner Demon gauge if you successfully kill the demon once it's summoned, or if they kill you. Alternatively, there are also a number of items within the game that can help you deplete this. Now, invoking is essentially the exact opposite of this, in which you can acquire items by spending any available space that you have left within your Inner Demon gauge. Each item will add towards your Inner Demon build-up, and it's essentially just a nice way of acquiring the odd item that you may be after for a particular scenario. Now, moving on to some of the bigger stuff, we do of course have 5 different weapon types within Wuchang, those being axe, dual blades, one-handed sword, spear, and longsword. Now, to begin with, there isn't much depth in the beginning of the game, but the weapons are absolutely where the most depth is involved, especially when involving the skill tree a little bit later on. For now, all 5 weapon types do have strict attack patterns, meaning, for instance, all axes share the same basic light and heavy attacks, and all spears share the same light and heavy attacks, etc. Additionally, these weapons all have a unique discipline, such as the first axe you find will be able to block, and all axes can indeed block, but this is not a discipline that is shared by any of the other weapon types, and is almost exclusively only unique to axes. Now, there are other disciplines available, and they can eventually be unlocked within that weapon skill tree, and as of then, you can allocate that discipline on any weapon of that type. For instance, we can take this longsword right here and change its default discipline from blink kick to sword counter instead. This principle is the same for all 5 weapon types. They all have a default discipline, however, they will have various different options available for you to unlock and switch between as you like. As a final note for the disciplines, you will want to familiarize yourself with these combo cards right here, as they will explain the nuances to each discipline, and oftentimes they will have hidden mechanics and benefits if performed correctly. Now, what is unique to each individual weapon and not just weapon type would be that particular weapon skill. Skills cannot be changed for a weapon, and you can consider a weapon skill to be its most defining aspect outside of its actual stats. Now, of course, to know if you truly like a weapon and its skill or not, you will simply have to actually use it, and also remember to check its combo card, just like the disciplines, as it will very likely have some hidden depth that you can take advantage of and will absolutely want to know. And in regards to these combos, if you see this icon here, then it means it will cost an additional Skyborn Might for that part of the combo. There's not much else to say about the skills. They're all unique, and you'll want to test them out to get a good idea of what you like best, and that would be the skills explained for the most part. Now, moving on to weapon benedictions, essentially you can think of these as small accessories for your weapons that do grant mild little buffs here and there. Any weapon can have any benediction equipped, however they cannot be shared between weapons at the same time, so no putting the same benediction into 2 different weapons simultaneously. There isn't much else to explain here outside of the fact that the benediction comes in 3 different types, and if you're able to equip 3 of the same type, then you will be granted an additional 4th buff, shown right here. Okay, we've got one last core weapon mechanic to explain before blending it all together, and that mechanic would be Temper. Temper is essentially Wuchang's version of imbuing your weapon with elemental or status effects. To do this, you will first require the respective bone needle. Here, of course, I just have the fire bone needle for now. An important note would be that no other bone needle will work on the Moonlight Dragon sword, due to the sword inherently having lightning already, and the game states that we would need the lightning bone needle in order to temper this sword. If the weapon has no elemental effect, however, or you have its respective elemental bone needle, then you should be fine to temper that weapon. Once the bone needle is inserted, this will be your default bone needle available within your item menu, and you cannot have multiple equipped at once, so whatever element or status you've chosen will be your only option. And finally, this item within your menu can be equipped to your toolbar, and here you can use it to imbue your weapon with the bone shards effects. So with all of the main principles and mechanics behind weapons explained, we should rightfully cover some of the basics surrounding combat before diving a little bit deeper. Combat is largely based around dodging enemy attacks. Of course, we have the weapons disciplines mentioned earlier on, like block or sword counter, but you can dodge regardless of weapon type, and provided that you do have enough stamina. To use skills, certain disciplines and spells, you'll first need Skyborn Might, which can be acquired by perfect dodging enemy attacks, or performing various other specific attacks instead, which we'll get into very shortly. And a very important fact to know would be the basic and heavy attack patterns for each weapon. Now, using the longsword as an example, the heavy attack is a stab when pressed, but a heavy upward strike if charging the attack instead. Light attacks cannot be charged, however, they do have an attack pattern, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, if you do continue to attack past this point, then the combo will continue as 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, and so on, meaning you have to actually stop attacking and start a new chain of attacks for the first and second attack to play out. This is important as all weapons have attacks within their attack chain that will reward Skyborn Might when landing on an enemy. For example, it's a second attack for a longsword that rewards 1 Skyborn Might, meaning if you do continuously spam with longswords, you won't be gaining much Skyborn Might along the way. To explain this and everything mentioned earlier on in much more depth, I have a very relatable example build for you all to use as a general guide and direction through putting your own builds together. First up, I decided to use the longsword and spear for this playthrough. I immediately headed into the left branch on the skill tree and grabbed myself some additional Skyborn Might and Vitality for extra max health. After this, I started heading into the longsword skill tree. Immediately, I was met with this skill right here, which, as mentioned before, this rewards 1 Skyborn Might whenever landing the second light attack from a longsword. Next, I found the strength upgrade, which informed me that axe, longsword, and spear damage is all increased by the strength stat. This is ultimately what dictated me choosing spear as my second weapon. And then, upon venturing into the spear tree, I found lots of agility upgrades, which increases the damage for dual blades, longswords, spears, and one-handed swords, which was convenient for me, given I'd chosen longsword and spear already at that point. So I do advise basing your decisions on similar choices, and having stats within both weapons branches that do directly impact both weapons damage will absolutely be optimal for builds in the long run. After this, I spent more time fleshing out both weapons skill trees, but favouring one more than the other for the sake of progressing through and exploring through available options. This is where I discovered the sword counter skill for longswords, which essentially does work just like a parry, and due to me using this weapon the most, I did really like the idea of having a parry available whenever I needed it. As you can see, I've gone with the flow, but also attempted to be optimal and efficient with my decisions, not allowing myself to be overwhelmed and simply just making my way through the skill tree and becoming comfortable with each new skill one step at a time. Now, one of the most important upgrades on each weapon's branch would of course be its mastery. This essentially dictates the level of that weapon type, and as opposed to what we'd expect from a typical Souls-like game, instead of investing into individual weapons, this is where we invest those resources instead, and doing so will level up all weapons of that type, as opposed to just that one particular weapon. Aside from being a very solid addition to Wuchang, do not forget to level these as and when you can for both weapons that you are using, as this will scale damage much better than most other upgrades available. And of course, don't forget that these can be leveled up multiple times, as can many other upgrades on the skill tree. Okay, so now moving on to gear and spells, we'll start with armor sets as this will be quite brief. Essentially, the sole purpose of an armor set within Wuchang is to make specific fights much more manageable to get through. For instance, if the boss is using a lot of corruption, then you want to put on good corruption resistance armor, and if the boss is using a big hammer weapon with no elements or status effects, then you'll want to wear an armor set with high blunt resistance instead. It's very important that you consider this, as some fights, and bosses especially, will be harder if not using an optimal armor set, and will be especially harder if using an armor set with very low or negative stats and nose mitigations or resistances. So if you're struggling with any particular fight, then consider switching up your armor set, as it may very well be what is letting you down. Below the armor sets, we do have accessories, and again, we're going to be very brief here. You will find these on your adventures. You can equip whatever ones you like, and they all grant little buffs here and there. They are nothing too special, but useful nonetheless. Next, we have spells, which can get quite a bit deep, so we'll dive right in. You'll find multiple spells throughout your adventures, and these can be freely equipped at your own leisure, and they all have zero casting requirements, other than their inherent Skyborn might cost. Now, a few things to take note of here would be the spell type right here. We have Magic, Feathering, and Other, which is self-explanatory. Magic scales with Magic, Feathering scales with Feathering, and Other seems to be utility-based spells that likely do not scale at all. Additionally, be sure to check each spell's description, as they may have hidden mechanics that aren't so obvious at first. For example, the Echo of Wuchang spell can be pressed again to perform a smash attack, and it does state that if this spell lands on an enemy's back, then they will immediately be open to an obliterate attack, which is essentially when you've drained their posture and get a free critical hit. Some spells do have more nuance than others, but just like skills and disciplines, do be sure to thoroughly read through and understand a spell's full potential before committing or moving on. Now, that is an awful lot covered so far, folks, and to be honest, there's not much left to cover moving forward, but some of the following info and advice is quite important. I just had no sensible section to include it prior to now, so consider this next bit somewhat of a dumping grounds for all of the random information and tips that I do have left. Bamboolings can be found throughout your adventures. You'll have to quickly chase them down and strike them to be rewarded with a bamboo shoot, and these can be used at the Panda Merchant for unique rewards. Enemies have posture bars, which build up as and when you attack them from behind. Staying aggressive and repeatedly attacking enemies' backs is a great way to build this up and gain yourself a free obliterate strike. If you didn't already know, you'll want to eliminate these birds as and when you find them, typically needing throwing knives or ranged magic for most of them. However, some can be meleeed with very specific attacks, so just consider this when low on equipment or Skyborn might. In regards to weapons replenishing Skyborn might on particular attacks, this is not limited to just one Skyborn might, meaning hit multiple enemies with that attack and you will receive one Skyborn might per enemy hit. And finally, Wuchang does have an incredible amount of backtracking and revisiting areas involved, oftentimes not very obvious unless paying very close attention to all of the dialogue and the lore items. The level design I've experienced thus far has been absolutely fantastic, but with this great level of depth, things can get confusing and certain locations and NPCs can get forgotten about quite easily, so just consider backtracking every now and then, as it is quite possible that backtracking may lead you in the forward direction. Anyway, that would be it for this guide, folks. I'll be back over the coming days with plenty more Wuchang guides, covering combat, exploration, some of the deeper mechanics, and likely plenty more along the way. I do, of course, have a range of guides and news videos on the channel already, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. But otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.